Chapter 1. The Candle in Marleycombe. On an early autumn evening, Marleycombe looked just as it always did. Quiet, self-contained, and faintly picturesque. The narrow cobbled high street wound its way between Tudor-fronted houses and neat little shops, each with its sign painted freshly after the summer season. Windows glowed with the comforting light of lamps, and the smell of wood smoke drifted across the green from cottages where curtains had already been drawn against the chill. It was the sort of evening, Miss Marple always thought, when one ought to feel at peace with the world. She sat in the small sitting room of the vicarage, where she had been invited for tea, and listened politely to Mrs. Weatherby's enthusiastic account of the forthcoming harvest festival. "Mr. Harper insists the choir must rehearse every evening this week," Mrs. Weatherby declared, buttering a scone with a determination that suggested she was equally rehearsed in committee work. "And as for the decorations, well, you know how particular Lady Dillingham can be about symmetry. Pumpkins on one side, gourds on the other, and heaven help the poor verger if a single sheaf of wheat leans out of line." Miss Marple smiled. She had attended countless harvest festivals, each one with its own little frictions, and she knew quite well that behind every gourd and pumpkin lay a small battlefield of village politics. Still, there was something comforting about it all: the repetition of customs, the certainty that small quarrels could be patched over by sponge cakes and hymn singing. And yet, beneath this surface of tranquility, something unusual was stirring. The church, St. Michael's, had stood at the heart of Marleycombe for more than 3 centuries. Its great candle, tall, white, and placed on the altar every year for the harvest service, was regarded almost as a symbol of the village itself. Tradition demanded that it be lit on the eve of the festival, allowed to burn steadily through the night, and then extinguished only after the final hymn on Sunday morning. But this year, the candle would not die. It had been lit, as always, on Saturday evening. Villagers leaving evensong had watched the flame flicker to life, steady and solemn, as the vicar pronounced the customary blessing. Yet when dawn broke, the candle was still burning, high and unwavering, its flame neither dimmed nor guttering. By noon on Sunday, word had spread beyond the church walls. The candle that wouldn't die, people whispered, crossing themselves or shaking their heads with unease. Some said it was a miracle, others muttered about ill omens. By Monday morning, Marleycombe was buzzing with gossip, so much so that when Miss Marple stepped out for her usual walk to the post office, she found herself greeted with wide-eyed remarks and lowered voices at every turn. It was a curious matter indeed. Curious enough to set tongues wagging from the bakery to the blacksmith's forge, and curious enough, too, to trouble the quiet instincts of Miss Marple, though she said nothing and merely inclined her head with mild interest when people spoke of it. What she did not yet know, what none of them knew, was that before the week was out, the candle would be more than a village puzzle. It would be the silent witness to murder. Chapter 2. Gossip in the air. By Monday morning, Marleycombe was buzzing like a hive. At the bakery, Mrs. Collins leaned across the counter and whispered to her best customer, "They say the candle's still burning. Not a drop of wax on the cloth below. Isn't that unnatural?" At the post office, Mr. Jeffries shook his head gravely. "My grandfather always said, 'Strange flames mean strange deaths.' You mark my words." And at the Red Lion Inn, pints were poured with muttered theories. Some claimed it was a sign of good fortune. Others swore it meant the opposite. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly in her little cottage, knitting needles clicking softly. She had already heard half the village's opinions without ever asking. She didn't need to. Gossip always found its way to her doorstep. But as she listened, she noticed something curious. Not everyone spoke of the candle with the same unease. A few faces, tight, nervous, guarded, seemed less concerned with the flame itself, and more with what it might uncover. Miss Marple tucked away the observation without comment. For in villages like Marleycombe, gossip wasn't just chatter. It was a smoke that always hinted at fire. And in this case, the fire would soon be murder. Chapter 3. A strange discovery. Tuesday evening brought a chill wind to Marleycombe. Most villagers stayed indoors, but young Tommy Briggs, delivering milk to the vicarage, was the first to notice. The church door stood slightly open. Inside, the air smelled of wax and damp stone. The harvest candle still burned, its flame tall, steady, almost unnatural. But that wasn't what made Tommy drop his bottles. It was the figure lying in the front pew. Mr. Harold Kent, retired solicitor, well-liked though with a sharp tongue, was slumped forward, his hat on the floor, his face pale. By the time help arrived, the truth was undeniable. Mr. Kent was dead. The village was thrown into uproar. Whispers turned into gasps, and fear ran through every street. Had the candle foretold this? Or had it hidden something darker? Miss Marple, standing quietly near the church gate, did not rush forward like the others. Instead, she watched the faces in the crowd, how some turned white, how others turned away too quickly. She did not yet speak, but she thought one simple thought. The candle was not the mystery. The man's death was. And someone in Marleycombe already knew why. Chapter 4. The First Suspect. Inspector Graves arrived from the county town by midday. A tall, serious man with a clipped mustache. He wasted no time. Natural causes? Someone whispered. Graves shook his head. No. Mr. Kent was poisoned. The word spread like wildfire. Poison. The villagers looked at one another with sharp, fearful eyes. Who could have done such a thing? By evening, the inspector already had a suspect. Mr. Kent had quarreled publicly at the inn 2 nights before, with George Sims, the local carpenter. Witnesses said Kent accused him of cheating over a debt. Sims had turned red with anger, slamming his fist on the table. Now every tongue wagged the same way. It must be Sims. He had a temper. He had a reason. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the corner of the vicarage drawing room, wasn't so sure. Too easy, she thought. Far too easy. And if life in villages had taught her anything, it was this. The obvious suspect was almost never the guilty one. Chapter 5. Whispers of Secrets. The news of George Sims's arrest spread quickly. By morning, half the village had already decided he was guilty. The other half only argued over how he'd done it. But in Marleycombe, gossip never stopped at one story. At the bakery, Mrs. Collins lowered her voice. They say Mr. Kent kept letters. Private ones. From a lady. Not his wife, mind you. At the post office, Mr. Jeffries muttered darkly. Old Kent was no saint. He knew too much about people. Held it over them, he did. And at the Red Lion, the innkeeper swore he'd heard Kent threaten more than one villager with ruin if debts weren't repaid. Miss Marple listened, knitting needles clicking as steadily as the church clock. She noticed what others did not. Every whispered secret tied someone a little closer to the dead man. Every story suggested a motive. Which meant one thing. George Sims might be innocent. Because in Marleycombe, there were far too many people who might have wanted Harold Kent dead. Chapter 9. The Hidden Letters. That Thursday morning, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage to deliver a jar of her quince jelly. While the vicar's wife fussed over the jar, Miss Marple's eyes wandered. Calm, curious as always. On the writing desk lay a small bundle of envelopes, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The top one was unsealed, and a name caught her eye. Harold, Kentucky. The vicar's wife noticed and blushed deeply. Oh, those letters. I oughtn't to have them, of course. He gave them to Mr. Kent for safekeeping, but, well, after the poor man's death, they came back into my hands. Miss Marple's knitting bag tightened slightly in her hand. Letters, my dear. From whom? The vicar's wife lowered her voice. From Mrs. Lydia Markham. Before she married Colonel Markham. Love letters, if you must know. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the faintest glimmer of understanding. So, Harold Kent had kept more than debts and quarrels. He had kept secrets, powerful ones, the kind that could ruin reputations if revealed. And in a place like Marleycombe, a secret exposed was as dangerous as poison. Chapter 7. Doubts and Contradictions. Inspector Graves was firm. Sims is the man. He quarreled with Kent. He had the chance, and the poison could have been slipped easily into a pint at the inn. Case closed. Many in Marleycombe nodded. They liked their mysteries simple. But Miss Marple's mind was never satisfied with simple. That afternoon, she quietly visited Mrs. Price, the inn's landlady. Over a cup of weak tea, Miss Marple asked about the night of the quarrel. Mrs. Price leaned close. George was furious, yes. But after he stormed out, I swear. He went straight home. His wife was waiting. Never came near Kent again. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And Mr. Kent's glass? Who cleared it away? Why, I did, Mrs. Price said quickly. Then, after a pause, no, that's not right. Mr. Jeffries from the post office. He picked it up first. Said he'd help. Funny, I'd forgotten that. Miss Marple folded her hands. A contradiction. A small one hidden in gossip. But small things, she knew, were often the key. And this one whispered that George Sims might not be the killer after all. Chapter 8. The Uneasy Village. By midweek, Marleycombe no longer felt like the same village. Windows closed earlier. Voices dropped when strangers passed. Fear clung to every lane. At the grocer's, Mrs. Collins whispered, "If Sims isn't guilty, then someone else is." And they're still walking free. Children were told not to wander near the church. Farmers kept to their fields. And yet, behind the fear, curiosity thrived. Everyone wanted to know what Miss Marple thought. But Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, gave no answers. She only asked questions. Quiet, harmless questions. And those questions revealed something strange. Several villagers admitted they had seen Mr. Kent on the day before his death, arguing in hushed tones with different people. One with a shopkeeper about money. Another with a young woman near the post office. It seemed Harold Kent had enemies everywhere. Yet what troubled Miss Marple most was not who quarreled with him, but who carefully avoided speaking of him at all. Silences, she knew, could be louder than words. And Marleycombe was suddenly full of silence. Chapter 9. The Hidden Letters. That Thursday morning, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage to deliver a jar of her quince jelly. While the vicar's wife fussed over the jar, Miss Marple's eyes wandered. Calm, curious as always. On the writing desk lay a small bundle of envelopes, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The top one was unsealed, and a name caught her eye. Harold, Kentucky. The vicar's wife noticed and blushed deeply. Oh, those letters. I oughtn't to have them, of course. He gave them to Mr. Kent for safekeeping, but, well, after the poor man's death, they came back into my hands. Miss Marple's knitting bag tightened slightly in her hand. Letters, my dear. From whom? The vicar's wife lowered her voice. From Mrs. Lydia Markham, before she married Colonel Markham. Love letters, if you must know. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the faintest glimmer of understanding. So, Harold Kent had kept more than debts and quarrels. He had kept secrets, powerful ones, the kind that could ruin reputations if revealed. And in a place like Marleycombe, a secret exposed was as dangerous as poison. Chapter 10. The Markham Shadow. By Friday, Whispers had a new name. Mrs. Lydia Markham. People remembered her as a pretty, lively girl before she married the strict and much older Colonel Markham. Now she was quiet, careful, almost frightened. It was said Harold Kent had once admired her. And now, with those old letters uncovered, the village buzzed with one thought. Perhaps Kent had threatened to reveal them. Colonel Markham was a man who prized honor above all. To him, a scandal, even from years ago, would be unthinkable. At the Red Lion, men muttered that the colonel had the means, the motive, and certainly the determination. Others whispered that Lydia herself, desperate to keep her past hidden, might have silenced Kent before he could act. Miss Marple, meanwhile, walked past the Markham estate that evening. She noticed the colonel's stiff figure pacing in the garden, while Lydia sat motionless at a window, staring into the dark. It was not guilt Miss Marple saw in her face. It was fear. And fear, she knew, always had a story behind it. Chapter 11. Testing Lydia. Miss Marple had a way of speaking that never seemed threatening. Her questions came wrapped in politeness. Her observations tucked inside gentle remarks. People rarely noticed how much they revealed to her. That Saturday afternoon, she paid a visit to Mrs. Lydia Markham, bringing along a basket of scones. "Oh, how kind," Lydia murmured, pale and distracted. She fussed with the teacups, her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled kindly. I dare say you must have known Mr. Kent quite well, my dear. He was such a helpful man, always ready to keep things safe for people." The teacup rattled in Lydia's hand. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she forced a smile. Yes, quite safe." Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting resting on her lap. She said nothing more, but inside her mind, the truth began to take shape. Lydia Markham wasn't hiding guilt. She was hiding terror. Terror that someone else now possessed her secret, and might use it. And that meant Harold Kent's murder was not about love at all. It was about blackmail. Chapter 12. The Collector of Secrets. By Sunday, the harvest festival flowers had begun to wither in the church, but the great candle still burned. Steady, watchful, like a reminder of unfinished business. Inspector Graves remained convinced George Sims was guilty. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She sat with her knitting by the fire, piecing together scraps of gossip like threads in her yarn. Mr. Kent had kept more than money debts. He had collected people's secrets. Private letters, old quarrels, foolish mistakes from long ago. Things that could shame, ruin, or control. The quarrel with Sims over a debt was loud and public. But blackmail, that was quiet, poisonous, and far more dangerous. One by one, Miss Marple recalled the faces she had seen since Kent's death. The averted eyes, the nervous silences, the sudden blushes. Too many villagers had something to lose if Kent chose to speak. But who had the most to gain from his death? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She did not yet have the answer. But she knew the killer was not chosen at random. The murderer was someone Kent held firmly in his net of secrets. And someone desperate enough to break free. Chapter 13. Another shock. Monday morning dawned gray and heavy over Marleycombe. The villagers hoped the worst was over, that with Sims in custody, life might return to its quiet rhythm. But by noon, another whisper spread through the lanes. The vicar's wife had gone into the church to straighten the altar flowers. There, near the front pew where Harold Kent's body had been found, she noticed something new. Another candle. Smaller, unlit, placed deliberately on the seat. Tied around its base was a strip of paper, scorched at the edge as though it had touched flame. On it were written just 3 words in a shaky hand. "One more will." The message flew through Marleycombe like a cold wind. Was it a threat? A warning? Or the killer's way of saying their work was not yet done? Inspector Graves called it a cruel prank. But Miss Marple, standing quietly at the back of the church, thought otherwise. This was no prank. This was a promise. Chapter 14. The Killer's Game. Inspector Graves dismissed the strange candle note as village nonsense. But Miss Marple knew better. Murderers often acted for practical reasons. Money, jealousy, revenge. Yet sometimes they needed something more. A sense of control. A thrill in watching others squirm. This message, "One more will," was not about warning. It was about power. That evening, Miss Marple visited the church again. She studied the second candle where it had been found. It was ordinary, bought from the local shop. But the handwriting on the scorched note was clumsy, almost disguised. Someone had wanted to hide their hand. But not too well. Miss Marple touched the faint burn mark on the paper. The same kind of scorch she had seen on the altar cloth. The candles were part of the murder, yes. But also part of a game. And the killer, she realized, was not done playing. Somewhere in Marleycombe, among the quiet faces and polite smiles, there was someone who enjoyed this far too much. Chapter 15. The Second Victim. It happened on a damp Tuesday evening. The fog rolled low across Marleycombe, muffling every sound. Most villagers had shut their doors early, uneasy after the candle note. But at the Red Lion Inn, a few stayed late. Among them was Mr. Jeffries, the postmaster. He laughed too loudly, drank too quickly, and left just before closing. He never reached home. By dawn, a farm boy found him collapsed by the lane, his bicycle toppled beside him. At first it seemed a simple accident, but the doctor's verdict was swift. Poison again. The same as Harold, Kentucky. Marleycombe reeled. 2 deaths, both tied to secrets, both shadowed by the strange candles. Some whispered of a madman. Others spoke of curses. But Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting untouched, because she remembered something no one else had noticed. How Mr. Jeffries had once helped by collecting Kent's glass at the inn. And now Mr. Jeffries was dead. Not a curse. Not madness. But a thread being cut, one by one. Chapter 16. A pattern emerges. By Wednesday, the mood in Marleycombe was no longer gossip but dread. 2 men dead. Both poisoned. Both somehow linked to secrets. And the strange business of the candles. Inspector Graves, under pressure, doubled the patrols. "It's a lunatic," he barked. "Someone playing tricks, striking at random." But Miss Marple did not believe in random. Sitting by her fire, she laid aside her knitting and thought carefully. Harold Kent, the keeper of secrets. Mr. Jeffries, the man who had touched Kent's glass. Both silenced, both with connections to hidden knowledge. It was not madness. It was method. The killer, she realized, was moving with quiet precision, not only removing a blackmailer, but silencing anyone who might reveal the truth about what Kent had held. The candles were not superstition. They were signals, warnings, perhaps even trophies. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in a thin line. The murderer was clever. Too clever. But in her long life she had seen cleverness undone, by the smallest slip, the tiniest thread out of place. And she intended to find that thread before another life was taken. Chapter 17. The tiny slip. That Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Collins at the bakery. Gossip flowed there as freely as the smell of warm bread. As they spoke, Mrs. Collins mentioned the second candle. Strange thing, that note. The paper looked scorched, didn't it? Almost as though someone pressed it too close to the altar flame. Miss Marple's needles paused in her lap. "Oh, and how would you know that, my dear? Only the vicar's wife and I saw it up close." Mrs. Collins flushed red, stammering. "Well, Mr. Harper, the choirmaster, said so. He must have told me." Yes, that was it. But Miss Marple's eyes softened with quiet certainty. She had heard Harper speak of the candle, yes, but never the scorch mark. Only someone who had handled the note would know that. And if Mrs. Collins had seen it herself, it meant she had been far closer to the mystery than she claimed. Miss Marple tucked the thought away, her face mild and harmless. Because in Marleycombe, killers gave themselves away not in grand gestures, but in the tiniest of slips. Chapter 18. Testing the baker. The next morning, Miss Marple strolled into the bakery with her usual gentle smile. The bell above the door jingled, and Mrs. Collins looked up from behind the counter, flour dusting her apron. "Good day, Miss Marple. A loaf as usual." "Yes, please," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. Then, as if idly, she added, "I was thinking of poor Mr. Jeffries. Such a shame. Though, perhaps, not unexpected. After all, he was seen handling Mr. Kent's glass. One never knows what may linger on such things." Mrs. Collins froze for the briefest second, her hand tightening around the bread knife. Then she forced a laugh. "Oh, well, you know village talk. People make stories out of nothing." Miss Marple accepted her loaf with a nod, but her eyes caught the twitch of nerves, the too hasty dismissal. Outside, she walked slowly, thinking. Mrs. Collins had always seemed harmless, cheerful, devoted to her shop. But under pressure, even the calmest faces revealed cracks. And Miss Marple had just seen one. The baker knew more than she should. And knowledge, in this case, was as dangerous as poison. Chapter 19. The Quiet Trap. Miss Marple believed in patience. She never accused, never cornered. Instead, she let people reveal themselves. That evening, she asked the vicar to host a small gathering in the parish hall. To comfort the village, she said kindly. Tea was poured, cakes were served, and people spoke in hushed, uneasy tones. When the moment was right, Miss Marple spoke up. "Such dreadful business with poor Mr. Kent and Mr. Jeffries. I do wonder if the poison might have been hidden in something most of us take daily. Bread, perhaps, or cakes." A murmur ran through the hall. All eyes turned, unconsciously, to Mrs. Collins at the back. Her face stiffened. Her hands, resting on her apron, clenched tightly. Then she gave a brittle laugh. "Oh, Miss Marple, how you do imagine things." But Miss Marple noticed what others missed: the sudden beads of sweat on the baker's brow, the trembling lip. The trap had been set with nothing more than words. And Mrs. Collins had already stepped into it. Chapter 20. The Final Test. The next morning, Miss Marple walked into the bakery once more, her knitting bag tucked neatly under her arm. Mrs. Collins greeted her with forced cheer, though her eyes betrayed a restless edge. "I wondered," Miss Marple said gently, "if you might wrap me a small loaf, one of the kind you baked for Mr. Kent. He always did praise them, you know." The baker's hands faltered. "Oh, did he? I wouldn't know." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, calm but piercing. "Indeed he did. In fact, he said he never tasted a loaf quite so distinctive. Though, of course, one must be careful what extras one adds to bread these days. Some powders are quite dangerous." Silence. The shop seemed to grow colder. Mrs. Collins's face turned pale, then blotched red. The knife she held slipped slightly against the counter. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "My dear," she said softly, "you killed Harold Kent because he knew your secret. And you killed Mr. Jeffries because he guessed it." Mrs. Collins's lips parted in a dry whisper. I had no choice." But Miss Marple knew better. There was always a choice.